I feel like it's Shuhei Yoshida's thing to come out and seethe about Nintendo, because I swear that's how he's spending his retirement, is just every time Nintendo does something, or whenever articles need to publish something negative about Nintendo, oh, former PlayStation CEO Shuhei Yoshida, it has something to say about that. I don't care, okay? Yoshida's a nobody. He's someone who was given the reins to the biggest company in Japan and was told that, like, you're going to put Nintendo out of business. And he failed, okay? This dude had every possible advantage going into this. He had, like, all this influence, all this control, all these resources, couldn't stomp out a much smaller upstart company. Like, he completely and totally failed. And he has to spend the rest of his life knowing that he failed to stop the growth of one of the greatest entertainment companies in history, Nintendo. The greatest Japanese company. It's always been it's been kind of amusing, kind of seeing these articles prop up. I talked about a couple of them a while back. He was saying that, like, Nier Automata saved Japanese gaming, and like. And he was, like, seething about, like, the 3DS price cut. It's been kind of funny, like, seeing this guy just reflect on his career and just how at every opportunity Nintendo just completely demolished him. It's been kind of funny to see. But, like, the thing that really gets me about this recent seed, from Shuhei, is that he is commenting on the Switch 2 Direct. So, of course, people are going to, like, take what he says super seriously and listen to him. And, of course, he has nothing nice to say. He is coming out saying that, like, oh, like, none of the games look impressive, and they just have a bunch of late third-party ports. He's doing the same thing we did, like, pointing out the fact that, like, the third-party portion of the Direct was, like, terrible, but instead of, like, acknowledging the reality of the situation and just acknowledge that, like, third parties aren't shit to begin with, like, he has to, like, spin it in this way that, like, oh, is this the best Nintendo can hope for? A bunch of late third-party ports? It's kind of pathetic seeing him do this, seeing him, like, ignore the reality of what's happening with the Switch 2. Just how big the Mario Kart is going to be, how big Donkey Kong is going to be. Like, seeing just how well a lot of these third-party games are going to do. Like, he is legit sitting there doing his best to try and act that, like, Nintendo isn't being themselves. It's like it's been like a reoccurring trend, going into the release of the new console, is that, like, a lot of people are trying to turn this into an Iwata versus, like, current Nintendo leadership thing. A lot of people who hated Iwata back in the day are now pretending that they loved him, that he was, like, a huge innovator at Nintendo, that he was doing all this stuff for them, which is true. Iwata is definitely, like, was definitely an amazing CEO. Miss him every day. But, like, this idea that people have come up with that, like, Kimishima and Furukawa have, like, somehow ruined everything that Iwata has built up is, like, so obviously insane. You can't possibly take it seriously. It's just so out of touch with, like, the reality of the situation when it comes to, like, the way these games look and they play and, like, everything Nintendo is doing right now. This idea that Nintendo has somehow lost its creative spark is just like a new narrative being pushed by the game journal media, hoping desperately that it'll take off, that people will, like, seriously believe that something like Astrobot is better than, like, every Nintendo 3D platformer. Like, they worked really hard to prop up Astrobot as much as they did, and it's not even going to be able to stand up to Donkey Kong. Like, that's just after they spent so much time, trying to degrade one of Nintendo's like premier IPs. Like a lot of people don't realize that Donkey Kong is an A-list Nintendo character. I would argue the A-list Nintendo character. So like the idea that people have that like oh like Donkey Kong isn't can't carry his own game. That's so delusional because Donkey Kong is what destroyed Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog sales peaked with Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And it's because Donkey Kong Country came out and just kind of demolished the narrative that like Sonic the Hedgehog looked particularly good or was interesting. Like Donkey Kong Country was just better. And of course, you have like the original 1981 arcade game, and you have like everything the character's been in since then. Like Donkey Kong is a video game icon. Okay. And this idea that the character isn't fresh or interesting, or that people aren't going to want to play this game it's just completely laughably off base. It's just completely delusional. Like, I think people are really underestimating just how well Bonanza's actually going to do. And I think this is a really good example of just how out of touch, Nintendo, the competitors of the leadership at Nintendo's competitors feel about the situation. They really have no idea at all, like, what people enjoy, what they recognize, what they remember, what they're looking forward to. Like, they seriously believed that Horizon Mini Yawns was, like, sold 20 million units and was competing head-to-head with Breath of the Wild. That's obviously not true, right? Never will be. But that was the narrative back when the game came out in 2017. That was what people were seriously pushing at the time. And they stuck with that narrative for years, years until it all just eventually collapsed, after like the sequel, the DLC to the sequel, and just everyone realizing that nobody cared anymore. But like Horizon Mini Yawns is just one example of just why PlayStation was not able to remain relevant. It was because of its reliance on third parties. It was because of its fixation on hyper-realism. It was because it overly westernized everything. It was because they didn't understand the industry. PlayStation, in my mind, has never really put out a successful console because PlayStation has never been able to build up a brand the way Nintendo has. People don't buy PlayStations because they love PlayStation. They love it. They buy them for the DVD players and because of Grand Theft Auto. That's it. Games that could easily run on a Nintendo Switch. That's the reality of the situation. That's why people like Yoshida are so terrified of third parties making the switch to Nintendo hardware. That is why so many people are seething about the Nintendo Switch 2. Like, the more third parties come over from PlayStation to Nintendo, the more people will realize that there's no benefit to owning third-party hardware at all. Xbox and PlayStation, fundamentally, at their core, have nothing going for them aside from major third-party games. The instant that these franchises make the switch over, there will be no reason to continue supporting them. And Nintendo will have established a monopoly on the console space.